guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to this week's episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Have you picked up my latest book yet? Kijo, Japan's Most Notorious Female Criminals is now out. If you want to hear about some of the horrifying, bizarre, and often confusing crimes that some of Japan's most notorious female criminals have committed, do check it out. It's available on Amazon right now. This week, we're looking at some terrifying tales of festivals and rituals from various little villages dotting the countryside. First up, a man on a business trip makes a few friends at a local bar, and one night, they decide to check out an abandoned village nearby. When they get there, however, not is all as it seems, and perhaps not as abandoned as they were led to believe. Find out why in Kawasaki Village. This is something that happened to me long ago. I stayed in Gifu Prefecture for about a month on business. I was way out in the countryside, closer to Mie Prefecture than I was to Gifu City. Still, despite being the countryside, there were karaoke bars and clubs. Plenty of things to do, so it wasn't like I was bored. And being that I was on a business trip, I was able to go home early each day without working any overtime. At first, I didn't know anyone, so I went straight back to the business hotel every day. But I started to get a bit lonely, so one day, I dropped by a nearby bar. This bar was managed by a single master, and it was rather small with only 5 seats at the counter and 2 small tables nearby. The master looked a bit like an older, rougher version of actor Sakaguchi Kenji. He was easy to talk to, and because I didn't know anyone in the area, I started dropping by there every day after work. After about a week of daily visits, I started to get to know the other customers there too, and we always enjoyed chatting about trivial matters. I got along especially well with a 40-year-old guy by the name of Takashi-san and a beautiful girl called Sa-chan. They were also good friends, so alongside the master, the 4 of us lived it up until the bar closed each night. One day, I finished work and made my way towards the bar as usual. I went down the short flight of stairs and opened the thick wooden door to the bar, and Sa-chan, who always sat at the counter, was sitting at one of the tables. Seemed she was there with her friends, and the 3 of them drank at the table. I sat at the end of the counter and ordered a beer and some pasta from the master. A short while later, Takashi-san arrived and he sat next to me. We chatted for a bit about international soccer, and then Sa-chan came over to talk to us. "Hey Yuki, do you believe in ghosts?" I was a little taken aback by the sudden question, but I loved those kind of stories, so I said, "Yeah, I do." And for some reason, Takashi-san, who was more than a little drunk by that point, started swearing that ghosts really did exist. Even the master joined in, and we soon started talking about scary stories. We each told a scary story, and then the conversation turned to tests of courage, and we decided to head out and try one. The master was the most enthusiastic of all, and he said he'd close the bar early. We helped him close up, and as the clock passed midnight, we headed out. First, let me introduce Sa-chan's 2 friends. First was Jun-chan. She was tall and slender, with long black hair. Then, Saya-chan. She was a small girl with a bob cut that really suited her. I felt bad about it, but internally, I was still evaluating all 3 women. And, in the end, my heart settled on the Asian beauty Sa-chan. The 3 women, myself, Takashi-san, and the master walked through the downtown area in front of the station towards the car park where the master's car was parked. The master was the only one sober at the time, so of course, he was the designated driver. His car was a famous German wagon. I remember thinking that I didn't realize running a bar could be so profitable. The master got in the driver's seat while Jun-chan sat in the passenger's seat. Takashi-san and Saya-chan sat in the second row, and then Sa-chan and myself sat in the back. Our destination was an abandoned village known as Kawasaki Village. Apparently, it was abandoned sometime between the Meiji and Showa eras, and there were still a few houses from that time left standing. Most were falling apart though. I wasn't a local, so I didn't know anything about Kawasaki Village. Surprisingly, the other 5, who were locals, had all heard of it, but none of them had ever actually been there, meaning it wasn't that well known in the area. The master, the oldest of us all, only barely knew the way there, and apparently it was an hour drive through the mountains to get there. But not only that, the road ended on the way there, so after that we'd have to get out and walk. I grew less excited when I heard that, but the other 5 were still in high spirits and even cheerfully humming. On the way, Takashi-san needed to use the toilet, so we stopped at a convenience store. We decided to grab some drinks and lights while we were there. Then, as we put the city behind us and passed through the rice fields, we were surrounded on all sides by nothing but mountains. We drove along the prefectural road that wove through them. Then we turned right at an abandoned drive-in, which was one of the landmarks on the way. From there, it was a real mountain road, barely paved and with bits of asphalt sticking out of the ground here and there. As we drove further, the road finally turned into an unpaved gravel path. Then, as we proceeded down that, we ended up at an unnatural open space. Beyond it was a black and yellow rope, and from that hung a sign. Landslide warning. No entry. City Hall. From here, the 6 of us would have to go on foot. We stepped over the rope and then proceeded down the gravel path. The trees blocked any moonlight from coming through, so we could barely see a thing. Plus the grass reached knee height, making it difficult to walk. That was enough to make it a respectable ghost spot in my eyes. But even though it had the right atmosphere, nothing felt especially wrong or off at the time. As we continued walking through the grass, we came across another open space. It was piled high with abandoned appliances and old tires, so they had probably been illegally dumped there. After we passed through that space, we reached an even smaller path. The women started muttering that we must have taken a wrong turn, but the master said we were going the right way. And I mean, there was nowhere else for us to walk other than this thin path that was surrounded by dense trees. We had been walking for about 15 minutes when the master, who was up the front, suddenly stopped. The rest of us followed suit. There were 2 large stone monuments at the same eye level as the master. They were spaced just far enough apart that 2 cars passing each other would just be able to fit through. The space between them kind of looked like a gate. Maybe it might be easy to imagine if you think of the Kongo Rikishi statues at Todaiji Temple. The stone monument on the right was square and about the size of a tombstone. It looked incredibly old and covered in moss. There looked to be writing on it, but I couldn't read it. Looking back on it now, I think the name of the village was carved into it. The stone monument on the left was round and incredibly big. It also had letters carved into it, but like the square stone, I couldn't read them. The only characters I could barely make out were consolation and monument. We passed through them, and finally we were in the village. My first impression of it, from the topography alone, was that it was a mountain village. I could see a few things that looked like buildings in the distance. First things first, we made our way towards them. The ground was covered in weeds and fallen trees, so it was a little difficult to walk. As we got closer, we realized the buildings were empty and abandoned. There were about 20 of them all up. They were all one-story wooden buildings, kind of like those tenement houses you see in period dramas. Almost all of them were falling down, with their beams and pillars exposed. We decided to go inside one that looked rather safe, comparatively. Taking off what was probably the sliding door, we stepped inside. The entrance was nothing more than a dirt floor, and above that was a tatami mat room. But the mats were rotten, falling apart and full of holes. We looked through the house carefully, trying not to trip over anything. We didn't find anything especially unusual, but it did appear to have been abandoned during the Meiji era. There were no electrical appliances or signs of lighting either. This was seemingly confirmed by lamps and candles that seemed to be from that era. When we were done, we left the house. Then we looked around another 3 or 4 houses that also looked easy to enter. There was evidence of people visiting the area, like empty cans of drink, but it looked like nobody had visited for at least several decades. The cans were a brand I'd never seen before, and I didn't see any plastic bottles either. After a quick look around, we decided to have a cigarette. The village wasn't as scary as I was expecting. We chatted about this and that as we smoked, and then we heard some kind of scream or animal growl or something that's hard to explain coming from the hill behind the houses. We all seemed to have heard it, and we all turned to look in that same direction at once. Again it screamed, although this time it sounded more like the roar of a beast than a scream. We all readied ourselves and waited for the 3rd time, but there was nothing but silence. What the hell was that? I turned to everyone and asked. It was the master who answered. Maybe it was a coyote. We don't have coyotes in Japan, do we? Sa-chan said. Yeah, I guess, but... The master seemed embarrassed and gave a shy smile. Everyone burst into laughter. Hey, why don't we go over and check it out? Saya-chan suggested. Everyone thought it was an animal, so nobody protested. We passed through the backyard of a house and then climbed up the small hill. We couldn't see it very well from down below, but once we got to the top, we found an open clearing there. And right in the middle was a small hut. There was a light on inside. Is someone in there, you think? Well, why don't we get closer and look? Curiosity outweighed fear, so we all moved towards the hut and then nervously looked inside. A bizarre scene lay before us. The room inside was about 10 tatami mats large. In each corner there were candles, salt, and then the head of a dog, pig, cow, and chicken. In the center of the room was a shelf like an altar with sake, sakaki branches, rice, and other such items on it. And the walls were covered almost entirely in letters written in black ink. But most surprising of all was the old woman with white hair praying in front of the altar. She seemed to be chanting, but it was hard to tell if it was in Japanese or not. Still, the rhythm of the chanting was somewhat comforting, kind of like that feeling you get when you're drunk. I looked around at everyone else. Their eyes were all narrowed and they seemed to be enjoying the sound of the chant. And the old woman continued unabated. Then she pulled something out of a linen bag. It seemed human, but it was kind of floppy. It was probably skin. It was so horrifying that Jun-chan and Saya-chan screamed, and thanks to that, the old woman realized we were there. So you've seen me, huh? That was what it sounded like she said. Next thing I knew, she was running towards us on all fours, just like a dog. We ran from the house and down the hill. There was no time to worry about our surroundings, but I could tell from the screaming and sounds of running that she was hot on our heels. We put the village behind us and ran all the way back to the stone monuments at the entrance. I could barely breathe as I stopped to check that everyone was safe. Seemed we had all made it. In the distance, I heard another howl. It was probably that old woman. No doubt about it, she was bringing the spirits of those animals down and into her own body. We all returned to the master's wagon in silence. Everyone remained silent in the car ride home as well. Next thing we knew, we had already arrived back at the bar. We all said some quick goodbyes and then made our ways home. I stopped visiting the bar after that, and before long, my month-long business trip was over and I returned home. 6 months passed and I finally stopped thinking about the old woman we saw that night. Up until then, I even saw her in my dreams from time to time. Then one day, my phone rang. It was from Sa-chan. "Hello?" I answered nervously. "Yuki-san, it's been a while." Naturally, her voice sounded no different 6 months later. "If you have a moment, I'd like to talk to you about something." It wasn't like I had anything else to do, so I agreed to head to Gifu the following Sunday. I arrived at the family restaurant we agreed to 2 minutes early. "Long time no see." "Ah, same to you." We exchanged simple greetings. "So, the reason I asked you out here today is," Sa-chan began. "Well, to be honest, I haven't been able to get in contact with Takashi-san or the master." Seemed she lost contact with them after that night. The master closed the bar as well, and word around town was that he had gone back to the countryside. As for Takashi-san, there was no sign of him anywhere. Then Sa-chan continued. "That's why I did some research of my own into that village." Having said that, she pulled out a file and handed it to me. Kawasaki Village, it said. Alongside the usual kanji for it was another set that sounded the same and yet used different characters. The characters for skin and peeling. Abandoned, 1927. From the middle of the Edo period to the beginning of the Meiji period, those who made a living selling leather products lived here. The population was roughly 100 people. It was a so-called discriminated area. They had little contact with the outside world and lived almost self-sufficiently from farming and hunting. By the latter part of the Meiji era, only 20 people remained, and by 1927, the last few villagers moved to a neighbouring village, and it was fully abandoned. Having read that far, it suddenly hit me. So then, maybe that old woman we saw was the last villager still there. Sa-chan nodded. At first, the village name used these characters here, the ones for skin and peeling, but they suffered terrible discrimination for it. And so, before long, they stopped most contact with the outside world and grew isolated. And because the main industry of the village came from hunting and animal goods, they honoured and enshrined the animals as kami. The stone monument we saw at the left was a memorial stone to all those animals killed. Then Sa-chan continued. It seems there was a family in that village who worked as itako, as shamans. They would summon the spirits of animals and use them to pray for bountiful harvests and the good health of sick villagers and such. And, once a year, they would sacrifice the skin of a person to the livestock kami-sama. It would seem that what we saw that night was the ritual taking place. I don't know what happened to the old woman after that, and I don't want to know either. But apparently, there are still 1 or 2 people who go missing in the town near Kawasaki Village each year, even now. For our next story, we're heading to another mountain village, this time with a rather unique kagura performance that is held each year. The narrator's older brother is picked to be the main performer, But when curiosity gets the better of them, well, find out what happens in Mokke. Amongst my friends, I am treated like a ghost repellent. If I ever accompany them to a ghost spot that's said to be haunted, then nothing will happen. When one of my friends rented an apartment where the previous owner had killed themselves and was suffering from supernatural occurrences, I spent the night and everything cleared up just like that. "Your guardian spirit must be insanely strong," one of my occult-loving friends said once. But if you ask me, it's not a guardian spirit lurking behind me, but rather something akin to an evil spirit. The first time I became aware of such a being was when I was a child. I was in the 4th grade at the time, and I visited my grandparents on my mother's side house with my brother, who was 2 years older than me. We stayed there for 7 to 10 days every summer holidays, around Obon. We always went there with our mother, but this particular year was the first time we went there alone, on the bullet train. My grandparents had lived in the area for a long time, but they weren't especially close to anyone nearby, so there were no other children around our age for us to play with. Now, it wasn't like we were being discriminated against. On the contrary, it was like others treated us with utmost respect. During Obon in my grandparents' village, there was a Kagura dance held in the shrine grounds where a dancer performed with a longsword to drive away demons, and this performer generally came from my grandfather's family. And that summer, the Kagura was to be held at the shrine like always. This time around, my brother was chosen to be the dancer, and so that was why we went ahead of our parents, so that he could learn the dance. But it wasn't just him. I was made to learn the dance as well. He hated the lessons, however, and found them boring, so my brother often ditched to go and play with our cousins instead. Still, he managed to learn the dance in time, and on the day of the festival, it was tradition for the main dancer to stay in the main shrine building from that morning. At first, he waited inside quietly, but the moment he saw his chance to escape, he pushed me aside and ran off with our cousins. There was a mountain near my grandfather's village that was forbidden to enter, and so my brother and cousins made their way towards it. Thinking that the grown-ups would be too busy with the festival to notice them, my brother and cousins snuck up the road behind the shrine, and then started up the forbidden mountain. According to my brother, there was an old shrine gate on the path leading up the mountain, and it was roped off with sacred rope. The gate was old, but the rope was new, so it looked like somebody had changed it only recently. My brother and cousins, being little brats, climbed over the rope and went up the mountain. As they went further in, the temperature suddenly dropped, making it hard to believe it was still summer outside, and they were assaulted by a raw stench that made them want to throw up. "Let's go back," someone said, but by that point they had reached an open clearing. There they found a large rock with sacred rope tied around it. Everyone stared at it in scared silence until the leader, one of our cousins in junior high, finally spoke. "Let's take something as proof that we came here, and then head back." Then he untied the sacred rope. Yet, the moment it hit the ground, it suddenly started to decay right before their eyes. As everyone cried at the strange sight, they heard a strange voice. At first, they thought it was one of the cousins crying, but then they realized it sounded like a growl coming from all around them. Something was growling and circling them in the trees. As soon as they realized this, they all ran. They fled down the mountain, all the way to the shrine gate, but once my brother hit the sacred rope, he tripped over it. When he looked back, he saw something large charging right for them. They all ran straight for the shrine and then into the main building. As for me, I was so bored waiting for them that I fell asleep. I woke up in shock when they all ran into the building crying and in a panic. But no matter how much I asked them about what happened outside, they ignored me. I thought that maybe they were upset because the adults had seen them trying to sneak out. My brother stayed locked up in the shrine after that, like he'd never gone out in the first place. But then right before the performance was about to begin, something bad happened. As he was getting changed into his costume, my brother noticed that his left ankle was terribly swollen. A substitute had to be found in a hurry, and so I was chosen. My brother was fine in the morning, so my grandfather and uncles grilled him on whether he'd done something stupid. Yet he and my cousins kept quiet about what they did, and the adults didn't notice anything strange either. If I recall correctly, the performance started that evening, and it began with numerous women dancing. The climax was always, the warrior with the sword drives away the dragon-like yokai. And when this happened, bonfires lit up the area. Both the warrior and the dragon wore masks, just like the lion dance at New Year's with 2 people in one pair. Then, when the dance was over, the warrior would spend the night at a small shrine a short distance away in the mountains. After the dance, I followed custom and went to the shrine. I was terrified to go alone, but 2 villagers joined me and waited outside. They called out every now and then, so it wasn't as scary as I thought it would be. But inside the 3 tatami mat wide room with only a candle still wasn't the nicest feeling. I wondered if my brother knew this would happen and that was why he didn't want to dance. They told me that it was okay to sleep in the shrine if I got tired, and because I was exhausted, I soon fell asleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but at some point I woke up to screams outside the shrine. There was supposed to be a bonfire out there, but it had gone out and it was completely black. The candle inside had also gone out, so I called out the villagers' names, but nobody answered. The only thing I could hear was something like a growl. Scared and thinking that one of the villagers must have gotten hurt and was in pain, I opened the door before I could stop myself. Then, as I stood by the door, something jumped in and pushed me out of the way. It ran around the inside of the shrine with great speed until it suddenly stopped on the spot. It wasn't quite a full moon, but when I opened the door, there was enough moonlight to clearly see. And, inside the moonlit shrine, I saw something strange standing there. It was bald, with a single eye and 1 leg. This monster was looking straight at me. The moment our eyes met, I screamed and ran from the shrine. I wanted to run back to the village, but it was dark and it was my first time at that shrine, so I had no idea which direction I should go. I saw a narrow path by the side of the shrine, so I ran for that, crying the whole time. I could feel the creature chasing me on its single leg right behind me. I finally reached a clearing, but it wasn't the entrance to the village. Rather, it was a cemetery with several old graves. There was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. That thing was going to get me. I knew it. Still, I wanted to get out of sight, so I ran and hid behind the largest grave I could find. But then the tombstone suddenly shook and fell, and something leapt out of the ground. It was an armored warrior with a bloody sword in hand. There was an arrow in his shoulder, and because he didn't have a helmet on, his long hair flowed freely. I screamed and fell back, but the warrior ignored me and ran up the path I had just come from with sword in hand. A short distance away, I heard something scream like it was dying, and as the sound entered my ears, I blacked out. When I came back to, it was morning. The priest and those in charge of the festival realized something was wrong when neither I nor the villagers who accompanied me returned that morning. And when they reached the shrine, they saw that something had gone wrong. The villagers were unharmed, but They were still lying on the ground until the priest found them and woke them up. My uncle then found me in the old cemetery around lunchtime. The villagers had no memory of what happened, and I cried as I told them about the monster with one eye that attacked the shrine and then chased me away. "Mokke was here," someone said. "Go and check XX," the priest then screamed. Oh, and that tombstone I hid behind was still on the ground, but there was no hole in the earth by it. I was then taken back to my grandfather's house, and the priest stayed with me the whole day. He told me all about that one-eyed monster. Apparently, locals called it Mokke. It lived in the mountains where it led villagers astray, attacked women, and sometimes even ate them. Yet there was a samurai who, with the help of a priest, sealed Mokke inside a stone up on the mountain. Sacred rope was placed around the stone and a shrine gate placed at the bottom of the path leading up to it, making the area forbidden to enter. And the Kagura performance was based on that particular encounter with the samurai and Mokke. To be honest, I thought it was all a lie, but I couldn't deny what I had seen either. As you've no doubt already guessed, my brother and cousins snuck into that forbidden area where Mokke was sealed up. The XX the priest referred to earlier was the stone where Mokke had been sealed. And according to the person who went to check it out, that stone had been split in half. And because the sacred rope by the shrine gate had also been undone, they realized that somebody had snuck in there. There was a big fuss as everyone tried to figure out what was going on, and because my brother couldn't keep quiet about it any longer, he and our cousins finally gave in and told them what had really happened. Needless to say, they didn't exactly get off lightly. That swelling on my brother's foot was probably because he tripped over that sacred rope. The priest turned pale, realizing that Mokke had been set free, and then I told him about the armored warrior I saw leaping out of the grave. At first he didn't seem to believe me, but then he turned to me and said, "It's true, I've never heard of anyone escaping Mokke's grasp before." The priest was worried not just about my health, but about whether he could protect me from Mokke as well. He asked some of the other priests from the same shrine to examine the rock, and they soon discovered that all signs of Mokke had completely vanished without a trace. Now, as for that armored warrior, it turned out that he was perhaps an ancestor of mine. The graves of those from my grandfather's side of the family weren't located in the cemetery by the family temple, but rather up in the mountains on a piece of land they owned. That was the cemetery I ran to when Mokke was chasing me. My grandfather's side of the family supposedly traced their lineage all the way back to a fallen warrior from the Heike clan, but whether that was true or not, I don't really know. But after that incident, I've been told by numerous people with the ability to see the supernatural that there's a good chance I'm now possessed by the spirit of a warrior, of something like a guardian angel. Like a guardian angel doesn't sound too amazing though. One person even told me, "It's protecting you, but that doesn't mean it's good." As for the Kagura dance, the area where my grandfather lived has now merged with other villages and cities nearby, so the area name has changed, and apparently so has the festival as well. For several years after our run-in with Mokke, my brother and I stayed away from our grandfather's village. I've heard that the Kagura itself is still performed, but it's no longer the warrior chasing away the demon dance that my brother and I learnt. I'd like to add one final thing. Perhaps because of the fallen Heike warrior that has supposedly attached itself to me, whenever I enter a Hachiman-related shrine, there is a good chance that I'll end up ill. I visited Kyoto on a school trip in high school, and when we returned, I got knocked out with a high fever. When I went to stay at my friend's place one night to help get rid of his ghosts, I was soon after troubled by a bad case of shingles. I don't know if that was just a coincidence or not though. Oh, and regarding Mokke, I found something very similar to it in Toriyama Sekien's Konjaku Gazu Zoku Hyakki. The creature there was described as a mountain spirit. However, the one I saw wasn't wearing something around its waist, but rather a tattered kimono instead. And according to my uncle, the samurai that sealed Mokke in that stone was also an ancestor of my grandfather. However, this wasn't a story from the time of the Genpei War, but rather something more recent. I asked my uncle about all of this again just recently. Since my grandfather passed away a few years ago, he's the one remaining person in our family who knows the most about this particular history. He was also the one who told me that I shouldn't visit Hachiman shrines anymore. And so, according to him, when recreating that moment of sealing Mokke in the stone, they made Mokke look like a dragon in the dance because they didn't want to depict him too closely and thus cause any sort of disturbance. I had completely forgotten all this time, but the mask of the demon also only had one eye as well. It had a horn on its forehead, so as a child I just thought of it as a dragon, and that was all. But then, if they were worried about causing any sort of disturbance, then why did they come up with the dance in the first place? I find that just a little strange. For our last story this week, a young man visits his father's hometown in Shimane each summer, and one year makes friends with a local boy. They visit a shrine where the boy wants to break in and see what's inside, but he ends up going alone when the narrator refuses. This, of course, ends up being a terrible mistake, and when they find out why, well, find out what happens in Belief in the Dead. This is a story about a festival from my hometown in the countryside. I used to live in Kobe, and when I was a child, I often visited my father's family home as well, a fishing village in Shimane. And when I was 9, we visited there during the summer. I made friends with a boy named A, and we hung out together every day. One day, A said he wanted to visit a nearby shrine. But he didn't want to just visit it, he wanted to go inside the main building. Let me explain a little about this shrine first. This shrine was built at the top of a mountain, and there was a shrine gate at the edge of the grounds, the first thing you saw. There were stairs leading from the top of the mountain to the bottom, and there was a shrine gate at the bottom as well. From the shrine gate, if you went straight to the beach, you'd find another shrine gate there as well, meaning it was designed to go straight from the shrine into the sea. Oh, and this was a shrine dedicated to Amaterasu too. Back to the story. I followed A to the shrine gate at the foot of the mountain, but I was scared of facing divine punishment, and something didn't quite feel right, so I told him I wouldn't go any further. A called me a coward, which annoyed me, so I hesitated for a moment, but in the end I decided that I really wasn't going to go. So I waited there for about 20 minutes, and then, finally, A returned. It was boring. There was nothing in there, just a mirror, he said. I was relieved to hear that. By the next day, I had forgotten about A calling me a coward, and we played together like always. And, before long, our fun summer vacation ended. A saw us off when it was time to go home, and I promised that I'd come back again. "See ya! Make sure you come back next year too," he said. "Yeah, that's a promise." We returned to Shimane the following summer, and as I was eating some watermelon, I said, "I want to play with A tomorrow." My grandmother and uncle's faces clouded over. Oh, my grandfather had already passed away long ago by this point. "Well, you see, we kept quiet about this because you were such good friends with him, but A actually passed away." Eh? About 3 days after the summer holidays, I think it was, he drowned in the sea. I was shocked. I remembered what happened the year before, and I wondered if maybe it had to do with him entering the shrine and then getting punished by the kami-sama, but I convinced myself that there could be no way. To make a long story short, time passed. I became a university student, and then my father passed away. In December of that same year, I got a call from my uncle asking me to take part in a New Year's festival back in my father's hometown. "Uncle, I'm in Kobe," I said. "It's gonna cost me a bunch to get there, so I don't have to take part, do I?" "Idiot! You're the head of the family now that your father has passed away," he said. "There's no way our family can't take part. Your father took part every year and you can just go back home on New Year's Day." And thanks to that, I had to listen to Mum complaining about it every year. Yeah, enough with the excuses," he said. And so, I was forced to take part. I arrived at 8 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and my uncle was waiting for me, annoyed. "You're late. You said you'd be here at 7. Sorry. I was eating some sea bream in Matsue, but the festival doesn't start till 9 p.m, so I'm still in time." "Idiot! Think of the time it's going to take to be purified." I was surprised when he said that. Was it really such a serious ritual? I quickly purified myself in the bathroom, put on my uncle's old formal wear with our family crest on it, and then ran over to the festival site on the beach. The beach was also full of people in traditional formal wear, and it seemed that not only was this festival forbidden to women, but only the family head from each family was allowed to take part as well. When the time came, the Shinto priest turned towards the sea and chanted a welcome to the kami-sama. Then we followed him up the path to the shrine grounds with torches in hand. After the kami-sama was enshrined in the main hall, various no and kagura performances were held, and the entire night passed in a frenzy of drinking and dancing. I guess that's what they call eating and drinking with the gods. As I was getting kinda tipsy from the sake, I noticed something odd in the main hall. There was some sacred rope, but the left was on the right, and the right on the left, meaning it was on backwards. What the hell? I thought, but I was drunk, so I didn't think much more of it. The next day, I casually asked my uncle about it. "Hey, why is the sacred rope in the shrine on backwards?" "What are you talking about? You took part in the festival and didn't even know that much." "I mean, Dad died before he told me anything about it, so why can't you tell me?" "Right. Sorry. Let me explain it to you properly. Please. That shrine is supposed to be dedicated to Amaterasu, but in reality, it's not. It's dedicated to something far more terrifying." Really? During the Meiji era, a survey was carried out of all the shrines and the kami-sama enshrined in them, but when the officials came here, they just told them that they were local kami-sama and they didn't know their names. Back in the day, most people were too scared to learn their names anyway, and they weren't interested to begin with. And so, the officials just said that it was dedicated to Amaterasu. And that's how all these nameless kami-sama came to be associated with the kami-sama of mythology. So then, you don't know what kami-sama it is? No, I don't know the name, but I know what type of kami-sama it is. Have you ever heard of belief of the dead? I have. It's when you venerate an evil kami-sama or spirit in the hopes of turning it into a good one, right? Like the Goryo Jinja Shrine and Tenjin-sama, yeah? You don't mean... Yep. They say that the ocean is connected to other waters, right? That's why sometimes bad things come from there. And maybe it's because of the topography or the tides, I don't know, but that beach in particular seems to see a lot of evil spirits and kami-sama. And when they gather there, fishing boats sink, the town gets flooded, and all sorts of disasters befall us. That's why we welcome them to the shrine before that can happen. That's the true meaning behind the festival. Then he continued. That's why the sacred rope is like that. Huh? What do you mean? Sacred rope is to keep unclean people from entering sacred spaces, right? Right. But that sacred rope is backwards. It means that those on the other side can't leave. In other words, the kami-sama inside can't go outside. It's sealed in there. I got chills down my spine when I remembered what happened in the past. I finally understood how reckless and dangerous it was that A went into the main hall of the shrine. He walked right into a nest of evil spirits and kami-sama that were trapped and unable to get out. Another chill ran down my spine when I thought about what would have happened if I joined him that day. Before I knew it, I had broken out in a cold sweat. A huge thank you and shout out to this week's Kami tier members, Baked Beans, Nocturne and Christina. It's thanks to your support, along with everyone else, that I'm able to keep doing this show, so thank you very much. Don't forget to pick up Kijo, Japan's most notorious female criminals, available on Amazon right now. And check out our newly revamped merchandise store at kowabana.store. And if you'd like to chat about this week's stories, come and join us in the Kowabana Discord. You can find that link in the description or on kowabana.net. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/TaraADevlin for exclusive bonus stories and extras, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan for all sorts of Japanese horror you won't find anywhere else. Thanks guys, stay safe and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.